The first thing the billionaire CEO noticed about the single dad was not his worn-out shoes, his tired eyes, or the small lunchbox tucked beneath his arm. It was the way he stood between her and a little boy who had fallen near the entrance of her company, as if protecting a stranger's child was the most natural thing in the world. Nobody in that marble lobby knew that by the end of 7 days, the woman who had built an empire without trusting anyone would be looking at that ordinary man as though he had become the one thing money could never buy. And nobody knew that the cruel little bet made behind closed doors would end up changing 3 lives forever. Before we begin, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of a good heart, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to Hardworking Dad. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to you. His name was Calder Rowan, a 36-year-old widowed father who worked 2 jobs and measured his life in school pickups, grocery bills, and the number of hours he could sleep before morning. Every weekday, Calder drove his 8-year-old daughter, Mara, to school before heading to a small maintenance company where he repaired office buildings, elevators, heating systems, and whatever else wealthy people expected to work perfectly without ever thinking about the person who fixed it. His clothes were clean but simple, his car was old enough to complain on cold mornings, and his wallet rarely contained more than what he needed for the week. Yet Calder had one thing he protected more fiercely than his own comfort: his promise to Mara that no matter how difficult life became, she would never feel alone. Across town, behind the glass walls of one of the most powerful companies in the city, Seraphina Vale, 34, ruled an empire worth billions. She was brilliant, disciplined, intimidating, and almost impossible to impress. Business magazines called her a genius. Competitors called her ruthless. Employees whispered that she could walk into a room and make everyone straighten their backs without saying a word. Seraphina had spent years proving that she could succeed without depending on anyone, and after a painful betrayal in her personal life, she had quietly decided that love was simply another weakness clever people learned to avoid. The ridiculous challenge began during a private charity luncheon when several of Seraphina's executives joked about her impossible standards. Someone mentioned that Seraphina had rejected every man who had tried to get close to her because none of them could handle her schedule, her personality, or her independence. Laughing over expensive coffee, one executive made a reckless bet that no ordinary man could spend 7 consecutive days around Seraphina without either quitting or begging to leave. Another suggested they find someone completely outside her world, someone with no money, no influence, and nothing to gain from pretending. The joke became a challenge, and the challenge became a 7-day experiment. Calder never knew about the bet when Seraphina's company offered him temporary work at her private estate. He had been recommended after repairing an electrical problem at one of her properties, and with Mara's school expenses rising, he desperately needed the extra income. The job was supposed to last 1 week. He would manage household repairs, help coordinate maintenance, and make sure the property was ready for an important daytime business retreat. It sounded simple. It was anything but simple. On the first morning, Calder arrived carrying a toolbox while Seraphina stood outside beneath the bright afternoon sky reviewing documents on a tablet. She looked at him from head to toe and immediately assumed he was nervous. He wasn't. He was simply tired. He had already packed Mara's breakfast, taken her to school, worked 4 hours at his regular job, and driven across the city. Seraphina gave him a list of instructions that would have overwhelmed most people. Calder listened carefully, nodded once, and began working. By lunchtime, he had fixed a broken water line, reorganized a storage room, and noticed that one of the security cameras was malfunctioning. Seraphina watched from a distance, expecting him to complain. Instead, he quietly finished the work and left a handwritten note explaining what needed to be replaced. It was the first time in years that someone had solved a problem for her without first asking what they would receive in return. On the second day, Seraphina found Calder sitting on the back steps during a short break, eating a sandwich from a paper bag. His phone was beside him, and the screen showed a picture of Mara smiling in a school uniform. Seraphina had never been particularly interested in children, but something about the photograph made her pause. Calder noticed her looking and immediately smiled. There was no embarrassment in him, only pride. He told her through his actions that Mara was the center of his world. That afternoon, Seraphina received terrible news about an important contract. A major investor was threatening to withdraw, and the executives around her began blaming one another. She returned to the estate furious and exhausted. Calder didn't ask intrusive questions. He simply noticed that she had not eaten and left a warm meal on the kitchen counter. Seraphina stared at it for several seconds before sitting down. It was such a small thing. But no one had done something small for her in a very long time. On the third day, the weather turned harsh, and a sudden storm caused part of the estate's power system to fail. Calder spent hours repairing it while rain poured across the property. Seraphina watched from the covered terrace as the man she had barely noticed 2 days earlier climbed a service platform to restore the electrical connection. He slipped, caught himself, and continued. When he finally came down, his shirt was soaked and his hands were trembling from exhaustion. Seraphina was angry, but not at him. She was angry that she had spent years surrounded by people who admired her wealth while overlooking her humanity, and now this exhausted single father had somehow reminded her what genuine care looked like. On the fourth day, Seraphina discovered that Calder had secretly been helping one of the elderly groundskeepers carry heavy equipment every morning before beginning his own work. She asked why he did it. Calder simply shrugged. He had noticed the man's knees were hurting. That answer stayed with her. By the fifth day, the bet had begun to fall apart. The executives who had started the challenge expected Calder to become frustrated with Seraphina. Instead, he began to understand her. He noticed that she worked through meals because she was afraid of losing control. He noticed that she became quiet whenever someone mentioned family. He noticed that she kept an old photograph hidden inside a desk drawer. Most importantly, he realized that behind the polished CEO was a woman who had spent years convincing herself she didn't need anyone. Seraphina, meanwhile, began noticing Calder. She noticed how carefully he spoke about Mara. She noticed that he never complained about working late because every extra hour meant another bill could be paid. She noticed that he repaired things instead of throwing them away, because he understood the value of something only after it had been difficult to afford. She noticed that he laughed easily when Mara called him, even though he looked exhausted. Then came the sixth day. Mara became sick at school. Calder received the call while he was working and immediately froze. His entire face changed. The professional calm disappeared, replaced by the fear of a father who wanted to be in 2 places at once. He started packing his tools, already preparing to leave without caring whether he lost the job. Seraphina saw everything. She didn't tell him to stay. She didn't remind him about the contract. She simply told her driver to take him home. Then she cancelled her afternoon meetings and followed him. For the first time, Calder saw Seraphina outside her world of glass offices and boardrooms. She arrived at his modest home carrying groceries and medicine, not as a billionaire CEO, but as someone who had decided that a frightened father shouldn't have to face a difficult evening alone. Mara was resting when they arrived. Seraphina sat quietly beside her bed, and Calder watched the woman who once seemed untouchable carefully straighten the child's blanket. Something inside him changed. The next morning was day 7. The executives gathered at the company expecting to celebrate the end of the bet. They believed Seraphina would finally dismiss Calder and return to her usual routine. Instead, she walked into the conference room holding the envelope that contained the original agreement. She placed it on the table. Then she tore it in half. The room went silent. Seraphina had discovered the truth about the bet the previous night. She knew they had treated Calder's life as entertainment. She knew they had laughed about whether a struggling father could survive 7 days beside a woman they considered impossible to love. But she wasn't angry because they had insulted her. She was angry because they had underestimated him. Calder had never tried to win her. He had never asked for money. He had never pretended to be someone he wasn't. He had simply shown kindness when nobody was watching. Seraphina found Calder outside the building later that morning. The city was bright with clear daylight, traffic moving through the streets as people hurried toward their ordinary lives. Calder was carrying his toolbox and preparing to return to work. She stopped him. For the first time, the powerful CEO seemed uncertain about what to say. She told him that the 7 days had changed the way she saw him, but more importantly, they had changed the way she saw herself. She admitted that she had spent years believing strength meant never needing anyone. Calder listened quietly. Then Seraphina did something no business victory had ever required from her. She apologized. Not for being successful. Not for being demanding. But for allowing the people around her to believe that a person's worth could be measured by money, status, or appearances. Calder didn't immediately promise her anything. He had a daughter to protect and a heart that had already been broken once. But he didn't walk away either. Instead, he invited her to have lunch with him and Mara. It wasn't a luxury restaurant. It wasn't a private dining room. It was a small neighborhood cafe where the tables were close together and the chairs didn't match. Seraphina smiled more that afternoon than she had in years. Mara talked about school. Calder laughed at something silly. Seraphina listened. And somewhere between an ordinary sandwich and a child's innocent joke, the billionaire CEO realized that she was falling in love. Not with Calder's poverty. Not with his struggle. Not with the idea of rescuing a single father. She was falling in love with the man himself, the man who had remained kind when life gave him every reason to become bitter. Months later, the company executives still remembered the 7-day bet, but they remembered it differently. What began as a cruel joke became the moment Seraphina finally learned that vulnerability wasn't weakness. Calder learned that opening his heart again didn't mean betraying the memory of the person he had lost. And Mara gained something she had never expected, a new person in her life who loved her father and cared about her too. Their relationship wasn't perfect. Seraphina still worked too much. Calder still worried about bills. They disagreed. They had difficult days. But they learned something more valuable than perfection. Love wasn't about finding someone who made life effortless. Love was finding someone who made the struggle worth facing together. And that was the real lesson of the 7-day bet. The executives had believed a single dad couldn't last 7 days with the CEO. They were right about one thing. Calder couldn't remain the same man after those 7 days. And neither could Seraphina. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who believes that kindness still matters, and subscribe to Hardworking Dad. Sometimes one small act of kindness can change an entire life, and your support helps these stories reach people who need that reminder. And before we end, here is a special request. Comment, "Kindness changes everything," below if you believe a good heart is worth more than money, status, or power. Because sometimes the greatest love story doesn't begin with wealth, beauty, or perfect timing. Sometimes it begins with a tired father carrying a toolbox, a lonely woman hiding behind a billion-dollar empire, and 7 ordinary days that prove 2 wounded hearts can still find their way home to each other. The bet lasted 7 days. The lesson lasted a lifetime, ***.